Hi, I'm Courtney Nash. I'm an editor here with O'Reilly, and I'm joined today by James Turnbull. Welcome, James.
Hi.
And James, you're a CTO at Puppet Labs, correct?
I'm the VP of Business Development currently, but it's a startup, so my title could be anything
All
next
right.
week.
So we're talking about your presentation, your talk at Velocity next month, which is about operations mythology. And I imagine that this could be full of all kinds of horror stories. So is it all horror stories?
It does touch on horror stories, but it's more about the whys of horror stories. I was sitting down last year and uh, actually at Velocity at the bar, strangely enough, and realized I was surrounded by web ops people who, most of us had been doing this for 10, 15, 20 years in some cases. And every single conversation seemed to fall into two categories. One was there was usually some discussion about some new cool technical thing. But as the sort of night wore on, the discussion all turned to the disaster stories, like and I believe sometimes in industries it's called sort of disaster porn even. It's the sort of fascinating stories that there was this time that we did this thing and it all went wrong, and then and more gory, the more dramatic, the better the story. And I started to ask myself, why do we tell these stories, and why is it so important for operations people to have this collection of when things went wrong? Because these are not generally things people are proud of. Like, it's usually a terrible, terrible sort of time where you might have been awake for days at a time trying to fix a problem, you know, uh, or where you or your colleagues are under an enormous amount of pressure. Um, and so I was interested to see, why do we tell these stories, and why are we so inordinately proud of the disasters in our life? And so I thought, well, I should explore this and do a talk about it.
So why do stories matter? What did you find?
I think stories matter. There's a couple of ways that stories matter. I think they're very much about community. So we bond very strongly on the stories we create. And I'm sort of looking at this in terms of there's both good stories and bad stories, and they both have sort of ups and downs. And in our community, certainly, shared experience is a very sort of bonding sort of thing. And I think you could describe the operations community as a sort of a subculture in many ways, and subcultures do have their own mythology. And certain people in our subculture, represent. Everybody knows John Allspaw because he's fascinated with postmortems and graphs, and people have described Etsy as the high church of graphs. Uh, Other people in our industry are known for behaviors and for incidents and things. And I think having that sort of strong fabric of ties in our community is where a lot of that storytelling comes from.
Do you think you have to be in the ops community to enjoy this talk?
I don't think so. I think this is I guess this is a deep dive into our particular subculture's sort of mythology. But I suspect if you gathered a group of developers or QA people or security people, in fact, I know if you gathered a bunch of security people together, you'll get the same stories. But if you gathered a bunch of airline pilots or air traffic controllers or um, uh, you know, pretty much any sort of electricians or plumbers, you name it, there'll be the stories about the one time I went to visit this customer and this was the plumbing problem and this was the thing stuck in the pipe, and all of those sort of things. I think every community has these stories, and I was interested in exploring as to why they existed and what they meant.
So, I mean, it is of course always great to sit around over drinks and swap horror stories. Um, what about understanding that process of sharing stories? How can that help people possibly tell fewer of those stories? Does that help to understand the nature of what those kinds of stories mean?
I think that was the most interesting thing for me was that the fact that um, these are not good stories in some ways. Like as I said, they're often about things that aren't good experiences, and they often exist and are told for reasons that aren't healthy either. So a really good example is the reasons why humans have myths is that they're like big warnings. They're like and they're both in terms of like, don't eat the red berries, or don't wander in the park after dark, but no, or in the forest after dark, Little Red Riding Hood style. But they're also ways of enforcing social order, um, and I think a lot of organizations, that mythology exists so that there was this big scary time in the past where this thing went wrong, and that's why we don't do this. And a lot of that stuff is that it's very hard to make change in some of those organizations because they have such a strong culture of mythology around particular processes or technology or applications. And everyone knows that you don't touch that machine over in the data center because of the bad time when Bob touched the machine. And as a result, it's very hard to do things in those organizations without sort of upsetting that mythology apple cart. And those stories are so powerful and so strong that you can be ostracized out of a culture by sort of violating the rules or the social conformity that those myths create. So that, yeah, they're not necessarily good things, and I'm trying to explore what those myths are, why how you can actually break them down, and how you can actually say, turn them into, keep the good myths, keep the stories that enforce that sort of social bonds between peers, and make people, because very much, I think it was Romy Misra in a talk a while ago was talked about the fact that you stay at places if you have a good story to tell about them. So trying to convert some of those myths into those good stories and get rid of those bad stories that constrain us in our organizations, or restrict our ability to make change.
So you kind of already answered my last question at the end there, but I'll ask it anyways because I'm asking everyone the same last question, which is what superpower will someone have after attending your talk?
I actually, because one of the things I am talking about is mythology, which is very much about superpowers and epic stories, and
Yep.
um, I'm hoping that a few people will be able to go on, take the hero's journey, and come out at the end of it having defeated all the bad mythology, swept it away, reinforced all the good mythology, and being able to sort of, bring their organization and their peers sort of to a happier place. We're all sitting around the campfire with our s'mores, and telling the good stories and not the horrible bad stories.
I just keep having time bandits playing through my head. This whole time you mentioned like don't touch it, and now I can't get it out of my head. So I'm gonna put a plea for like a little time
Uh,
bandit slide. But
I'm hoping to have an open fire and some s'mores. I'm not sure that the occupational health and safety people will be too keen on that, but we'll see how we go.
well, that alone is a good incentive to attend your talk, s'mores. So well, we look forward to having you join us at Velocity in June, James. Thanks for joining us today.
Excellent. Thank you very much.